What's going on, everybody? Anthony Servino here, Face Off Sports Network, with my top starts and sits at the wide receiver position for NFL Week 9. But before we get into the action, let's recap how we did in Week 8. And there is room for improvement, as always. I told you to start Jaden Reed, DJ Moore, and George Pickens. Well, Jaden Reed, dud, 7.5 PPR points. DJ Moore, super dud in a smash matchup, 5.4 PPR points. George Pickens with 11.4. But if anybody watched that game, he had multiple big plays, including a big touchdown called back. But that doesn't help our fantasy teams. But at least George Pickens gave us a solid day. And my sits, told you to sit Deontay Johnson. He ended up being inactive, and we know when it's all said and done, he was probably inactive because he was on the trade market and they didn't want to get him hurt. At least that's my opinion. So that's obviously a 0, but you didn't start him anyway. Christian Kirk, 7.9 PPR points. He suffers a season-ending injury. And then the big miss, Marvin Harrison Jr., 23.1 PPR points. Marvin, it was a bad matchup. And I did not like what I've been seeing when it comes to his rapport with Kyler Murray. So in theory, the right thing to do was sitting Marvin Harrison. Unfortunately, it blew up in my face. My apologies out to all of you for my misses this week. I need to do better. And we're going to start doing better right now with my first start. And that's going to be Chris Olave. Chris Olave, a little bit of a bust this year, right? Where we drafted him second, if you're lucky, early third round. Hasn't really performed up to expectations. Things are going to change. And I think they begin to change this week. We could see Derek Carr back under center, but even if we get another quarterback, he didn't perform badly last week. In fact, 18.7 PPR points for Chris Olave last week against the number one defense against enemy wide receivers, the Chargers. 8 of 14 targets for 107 yards. 14 targets, his second most, or his most of the season, and only the second time he's had double-digit targets. If we look at the target share for Chris Olave, he's had 2 other games with 6 targets, and every other game he played with under 2. That's not going to fly, and that's not going to happen moving forward because there is no Rashid Shaheed. There is not a real threat in this wide receiver room outside of Chris Olave. They brought in MVS. You got Cedric Wilson, who's banged up. They have Mason Tipton, Bub Means, Jermaine Jackson. This is a skeleton crew wide receiver room, which means I'm expecting a large, significant target share down the line for Chris Olave. Right now, he's being targeted on 24.6% of the routes he is running. He is averaging 2.21 yards per route run, which is 90th percentile at the wide receiver position using the tools at rotowire.com with a 72.1% catch rate. I think that catch rate will improve moving forward once we get a healthy Derek Carr under center. And now the matchup is good. He gets the Carolina Panthers. This defense, we know it is an absolute mess in Carolina on both sides of the ball. Their secondary, they could be troublesome, but I'm not really fearing this secondary whatsoever. In fact, if we look, the Cardinals, they allowed 17 PPR points to Cortland Sutton last week. And Sutton, he's been one of the biggest hit or miss wide receivers. You know, we've seen guys like Quentin Johnston go off for 551 and 2 touchdowns. Trey Tucker, 796 and 1 in the same game. Jacoby Myers back in week 3, 762 and 1. DJ Moore, who's been a disappointment this year, goes for 27.5 PPR points, 5 for 105 and 2. Drake London goes off 674 and 1, 19 PPR points. So you see where I'm going here. There is fantasy production to be had in this matchup, and I love Chris Olave to start building momentum this week. Next up, we're going to go to Josh Downs. Talk about an outstanding wide receiver. Now, we have to put out there that Josh Downs is dealing with a toe injury and he did not practice Wednesday. Michael Pittman's also dealing with the back and is not practicing either, but I believe both receivers will play. But the one I care about is Josh Downs. He's been performing as the number one wide receiver in this Colts wide receiver room. In fact, he's had at least 9 targets in every game since week 4, but 1. And in all of those games, we were getting at least 15.9 PPR points, and he's gone for over 22 PPR points in 2 of those matchups, including last week. He had 9 targets, but he only caught 4 for 109 and a touchdown. That's great. There was meat left on the bone, but a lot of the reason was because where were those targets coming from? Anthony Richardson, and the quality of targets was not there. What do we know now? Anthony Richardson is riding the bench rest of the season, barring injury to Joe Flacco, which means it is full speed ahead. Josh Downs is a locked and loaded fantasy receiver, and I don't give a damn about the matchup because he's been fairly matchup proof this year. And now he has the right quarterback, at least for fantasy, under center. This is a guy being targeted 24.1% of the routes he is running. He is getting 20.3% of his team targets, and he's taking that momentum into an outstanding matchup against Minnesota. Minnesota is the easiest defense when it comes to fantasy production conceded to the wide receiver position. They're a good defense. They're a good team overall, but their secondary has a lot of holes. In fact, if we look at the past 3 games, the NFL average when it comes to points allowed to wide receivers is 31.5 per game. Minnesota in the past 3 games, they're giving up 49.7, which is a 59.8% positive differential. Wide receivers feast in this matchup. We've seen multiple wide receivers high in the double digits, over 20 PPR points. And I think this is a smash spot for Josh Downs. Let's go to Xavier Worthy. Xavier Worthy starting to come along a little bit. Now, I get that they brought in DeAndre Hopkins, but are we going to get a full complement of DeAndre Hopkins in his first game last week in Kansas City? He only plays 22 snaps. Is he going to see limited snaps again this week? If we do, I do think there is room for Xavier Worthy to go off, and we'll talk about the matchup against Tampa in a little bit, but Worthy, outside of week 1 when he popped, he's been a solid wide receiver. Since week 4, he's gotten going a little bit. Now that he's a rookie, he's getting acclimated into the offense. 3 out of his past 4 games, over 11.8 PPR points. He is getting, in his past 3 games, at least 6 targets, and now back-to-back game with 8 targets, which are both season highs in that category. Some awesome metrics here. He's getting 33.2% of his team air yards, which is 91st percentile. He's averaging 7.1 yards after the catch, 91st percentile. We know what this speedster brings to the table. And I think DeAndre Hopkins ultimately can open things up for Xavier Worthy. This matchup against Tampa, it is what we like to call a dream matchup. Tampa Bay, they are terrible at defending enemy wide receivers. I get Minnesota's bad. Tampa, the past few games, they're really bad. You know, we have now seen in back-to-back games, Darnell Mooney and Rashad Bateman, both ancillary wide receivers in their own team, go for over 20 PPR points. In 3 out of the past 4 games since week 5, not only did we see Bateman and Mooney, but back in that week 5 matchup, London and Mooney both go for 30 each. Cardell Hodge, 14. Ray, 12. Bub Means went for 15 against this matchup. This is an outstanding matchup, and I get what you're saying. Well, Kansas City's not exactly playing great, and they're not. But they do seem to be playing better, at least last week against the Raiders, who have a pretty good secondary. Mahomes did find a way to play well, completed 71.1% of passes, which is his best completion percentage since week 2. 2 passing touchdowns, his most since week 3. This was in 262 yards, his most since week 5. It is starting to come along. DeAndre Hopkins helps the situation, and I think this is a really nice spot for Xavier Worthy to pop in a projected shootout. If you like content like this, please help us out. Hit the like button, hit the subscribe button, and the alert icon. So you can be notified anytime we go live, and we do that almost every day. Or when we drop content like this, which we do almost multiple times a day. If you have start sit questions, waiver questions, trade questions, ask them in the comment section below. Myself or one of my teammates here at the Face Off Sports Network will get back to you as soon as we can. Let's go to my sits. We're going to start with Jaylen Waddle. We were all in belief that Jaylen Waddle was getting Tua back, as was Tyreek Hill, and all was going to be well. They had the matchup against Arizona, which on paper was outstanding. Tyreek Hill had an okay game. He, underperformed expectations, but he still managed 13 PPR points, 6 for 72 without a touchdown. Jaylen Waddle, on the other hand, not so much. 8.5 PPR points, 4 of 6 targets for 45 yards. In fact, outside of week 1 against Jacksonville, Jaylen Waddle has been a disappointment without Tua, in the single digits in PPR every single game, has yet to have a game with more than 8 targets. In fact, every game outside of that one with 8, he's had under 6 targets. Now you get the Buffalo Bills. And the Buffalo Bills is a really, really tough matchup. I don't like it at all. You can run on Buffalo, but their defense overall seems to be tightening up. If we go back to week 2, that was the Tua game where he got injured. Unfortunately, Tua was not playing well against Buffalo. In fact, Tua never really plays well against the Buffalo Bills, and neither does Jaylen Waddle. And I'm going to pull this up right now, where in his career, Jaylen Waddle has only gone for double-digit PPR points 2 times. And that was back in 2022. So he has a 3-game streak right now with under 4 receptions, 46 yards without a touchdown. We are sitting Jaylen Waddle. We're going to sit Amari Cooper. Amari Cooper on the injury report with a wrist. He was limited. He probably plays, but it is worth noting that he's a little bit banged up. Why? Because he's 2 games with Buffalo, one of which, and his first one, surprisingly, in a tough matchup against Tennessee, goes for 16-plus PPR points, 4 for 66 and a touchdown on 5 targets. What's significant is he only played 18 offensive snaps. Well, last week, he only played 35. Meanwhile, Keon Coleman played 58. So Cooper is maybe in that 50 to 60 snap percentage range, and now he's dealing with the injury. It's a tough matchup against a Miami defense. I don't love it. And plus, who knows if they're going to have to throw a lot. If Buffalo does what they normally do in this matchup, they can run down Miami's throat, and Josh Allen might not have to pass, which means we might not see a lot of Amari Cooper, who has only had 7 targets total in his past 2 games, 5 total receptions since coming to Buffalo, and 69 total yards with that 1 touchdown. All of that came in week 7. Last week against Seattle, where he did play more snaps, he caught 1 of 2 targets for 3 yards. It was the Shakir, Coleman, Kincaid, Cook game. Now we have a lot more mouths to feed. We have an injury to deal with, and we have a tough matchup, which is why I'm sitting Amari Cooper. Let's go to my final sit. That's Jerry Jeudy. In theory, Jerry Jeudy's a wide receiver 1 on what looks like an ascending Browns offense with Jameis Winston. Jerry Jeudy last week had a solid game. 8 targets, 5 for 79, 12.9 PPR points. Well, the problem is he had a similar stat line to Elijah Moore, who had 16.5 PPR points, 8 for 85 on 12 targets. So Elijah Moore, the presumed wide receiver 3, was hyper-targeted more than Jerry Jeudy. And Cedric Tillman, who we all love on waivers, he had 9 targets, catching 7 for 99 and 2 touchdowns. In fact, Tillman has 12 and 9 targets in his past 2 games. It looks like Tillman is emerging as the one Jerry Jeudy might be the big play guy where Elijah Moore is the slot receiver. There's a lot of mouths to feed, and I think Jameis Winston, who's a solid quarterback, is going to do a good job spreading the football around, and unless he connects for Jerry Jeudy on a big play and Jerry Jeudy finds a touchdown, I think the ceiling and the upside is limited. They all did really well the past two games. Against Cincy, that secondary has holes, and now last week against Baltimore, the second easiest matchup for fantasy wide receivers. It gets a lot tougher. They get the Chargers this week. The Los Angeles Chargers, they're the number one defense when it comes to fantasy points conceded to enemy wide receivers. They don't give up a damn thing. For the season, the NFL average for fantasy points per game to the wide receiver position for the year so far is 32.4 points per game. The Chargers are allowing 24.9. That is a negative 22.9 differential. This secondary is for real, and I am sitting Jerry Jeudy in this matchup.